Welcome to this remarkable frontier chronicle, where forgotten wisdom and unexpected innovation collide with tradition in ways that would forever change the course of local history. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're listening from and the exact time of day or night you found this story. It's always fascinating to see how far these frontier tales travel and when they reach you. The winter of 1847 had already claimed its first victims in the small settlement of Clearwater Ridge, nestled in the western foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Most travelers passing through paid little attention to this remote outpost, but those who needed shelter from November's bitter winds found themselves drawn to the flickering lights of Malcolm Reed's trading post and way station. A sturdy log structure built against the eastern slope of the ridge, it stood as a lonely sentinel against the encroaching wilderness, a final stop before travelers ventured farther west into territories unknown. 3 miles east of Clearwater Ridge, the frozen body of Ezekiel Danvers had been discovered by a hunting party, his wagon overturned in a gully, his supplies scattered and picked clean by scavengers. The official record at the county seat would list his death as misadventure, another nameless casualty of frontier ambition. But those who found him noted with grim recognition the telltale signs of poor preparation, inadequate clothing, insufficient provisions, no tools for emergency shelter construction. The bitter truth of frontier life was etched into Danvers' blue-tinged fingers and frost-rimmed eyes. The unprepared rarely survived to learn from their mistakes. Word of the death had reached Malcolm Reed through a party of hunters who had stopped at his trading post the previous evening. He had listened in silence, his weathered face betraying no emotion, as they described the grim discovery. When they finished their tale, he had simply nodded once and added another log to his peculiar hearth. "Winter gives no second chances," he had remarked, the first and only comment he offered on the matter. Malcolm himself was an enigma. At 57 years of age, his weathered face bore the silent testimony of decades spent on the frontier. Unlike most settlers who had been pushed westward by circumstance or drawn by the promise of land, Malcolm had chosen this isolated existence deliberately. A former blacksmith from Boston, he had walked away from a successful business 23 years prior after losing his wife and infant daughter to scarlet fever. With nothing but his tools, a mule, and an unquenchable need for solitude, he had ventured west, eventually settling at this remote crossroads where two trading routes briefly converged. The ghosts of his past rarely troubled his waking hours anymore. 2 decades of frontier discipline had taught him to compartmentalize memory with the same efficiency he applied to splitting wood or preserving meat. But occasionally, in the deepest hours of winter nights, he would find himself staring into the precisely designed flames of his hearth, remembering Catherine's laugh or the weight of infant Sarah in his arms. Those moments of remembrance had grown less painful over the years, transformed from jagged wounds into smooth stones of memory, worn comfortable by time. The trading post itself was a marvel of practical frontier engineering. While most structures in the territory were hastily erected with function trumping form, Malcolm's building reflected years of quiet observation and meticulous improvement. Its foundation was raised 3 feet above the ground on fieldstone footings that kept spring floodwaters at bay. The walls were double thick, with a mixture of clay, straw, and crushed limestone, packed between inner and outer log courses, a technique Malcolm had observed among German settlers further east. But it was the central hearth that drew the most bewildered stares from those passing through. The hearth had been Malcolm's obsession for nearly 5 years. He had dismantled and rebuilt it 3 times, each iteration more refined than the last, until he had achieved precisely the effect he sought. The design had come to him through an old book of scientific essays he had traded from a professor traveling west to document indigenous plant species. The volume contained several papers by Sir Benjamin Thompson, known as Count Rumford, detailing his experiments with heat and fireplace design in the late 1700s. Malcolm, with his blacksmith's understanding of fire and metal, had immediately recognized the practical genius of Rumford's approach. Unlike the traditional fireplaces of the day, which were typically deep, square recesses with straight backs, Malcolm's hearth featured a peculiar design. The firebox was unusually shallow, no more than 16 inches deep, but significantly taller than was common, rising nearly 5 feet from floor to lintel. The sides were angled outward at precisely calibrated degrees, and the back wall stood straight and true rather than sloping forward. Most peculiar of all was the rounded smoke chamber that narrowed to meet the flue, resembling nothing so much as an upside-down funnel. Each element had been measured to the fraction of an inch, each angle calculated with mathematical precision. Malcolm had spent weeks seeking the perfect stones, rejecting dozens that others would have found perfectly adequate, insisting on materials that could withstand the intense heat his design would generate. The result was not merely functional, but possessed a severe beauty born of perfect utility, like a well-crafted tool whose form was completely dictated by its purpose. "Waste of good stone," muttered Jacob Harmon, leader of a small wagon party that had sought refuge at the trading post as a fierce November storm descended upon the ridge. Man could fit twice the wood in a proper hearth. A successful merchant from Cincinnati with aspirations of establishing a trading empire in the Western Territories, Harmon had little patience for frontier eccentricities. His party of 7, including his business partner Thomas Wesley, 3 hired men, and 2 wagon drivers, had been making good time until the unexpected early storm had forced them to seek shelter. Harmon was a thick-bodied man of 45, with close-set eyes that constantly calculated profit and loss in every situation. He wore the prosperity of Cincinnati's merchant class with unconscious arrogance. His coat of fine wool, his boots handcrafted by a German cobbler, his pocket watch of silver rather than the more common brass. He had built his fortune on a keen understanding of supply chains and an unerring instinct for exploiting shortages. The Western Territories represented the logical expansion of his commercial empire, and he viewed the journey not as an adventure, but as a business reconnaissance. "At least he's charging fair rates for the night," Wesley commented quietly, as they settled their packs in the corner assigned to them. A leaner man than his partner, with a clerk's careful mannerisms and a perpetual furrow between his brows, Thomas Wesley served as Harmon's pragmatic counterbalance. Where Harmon saw opportunity in every transaction, Wesley calculated risk. Together they had navigated Cincinnati's competitive commercial landscape with remarkable success, but the frontier represented an uncomfortable departure from Wesley's carefully ordered world. Malcolm said nothing in response to the criticism. He merely continued arranging the logs in his peculiar hearth, standing them on end against the straight back wall, rather than laying them flat, as was common practice. This, too, drew skeptical glances from his guests. "Never seen a man stack wood standing like fence posts," Wesley observed, with a dismissive chuckle. "Suppose every man's entitled to his folly." "Ought to build yourself a proper Pennsylvania fireplace if you want heat," offered Elias Finch, one of Harmon's wagon drivers. A grizzled veteran of frontier transport, Finch had navigated the treacherous routes between eastern cities and western outposts for nearly 15 years. His face was a topographical map of frontier hardship, a scar across his left cheek from a Shawnee arrow that had narrowly missed taking his eye, a crooked nose broken in a St. Louis tavern brawl, calloused hands permanently darkened by decades of campfire smoke. "My father built 'em for 30 years. This contraption will burn itself out before you've finished your supper." Malcolm finally spoke, his voice low and measured from years of limited use. "This fire will burn hotter with half the wood of your Pennsylvania box. It will throw more heat into the room and draw less air out the chimney." He did not look up as he spoke, focused on positioning the logs just so, with small kindling nestled beneath. Harmon's laughter filled the room. "Half the wood? That's bold talk from a man with a fire pit too shallow to hold a decent log. I've stayed at every manner of inn and station from Philadelphia to St. Louis, And I've yet to see such a peculiar arrangement. Wesley joined in. Economics of wood, my friend. This is backwoods ignorance dressed up as innovation. The third member of Harmon's core group, a young accountant named Peter Hollister, remained silent during this exchange, but his eyes followed Malcolm's methodical preparations with genuine curiosity rather than mockery. Unlike his employers, Hollister had been raised on a small farm in Pennsylvania before seeking opportunity in Cincinnati's growing commercial sector. He recognized in Malcolm's movements the same careful efficiency his father had employed when preparing for winter. No wasted motion, no unconsidered action. Malcolm struck a long match and touched it to the kindling. The flame caught immediately, racing up the vertical logs with unusual vigor. Within minutes, a steady, intense heat began radiating into the room, far more quickly than would be expected from a newly lit fire. The travelers fell silent, watching as the strange hearth performed its work. "It's a Rumford design," Malcolm explained quietly, naming the hearth after its inventor, Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, whose scientific approach to fireplace construction had briefly gained popularity in the early part of the century before falling out of fashion. The angled sides reflect heat outward. The straight back and tall opening maximize radiant heat. The rounded throat creates a venturi effect that speeds the smoke up the chimney without pulling as much warm air from the room. The travelers exchanged glances, their earlier mockery tempered by the undeniable warmth now filling the trading post. Outside, the wind howled with increasing fury, rattling the shutters and driving icy pellets of sleet against the windows. Inside, the Rumford hearth cast a warm, steady glow throughout the main room. "Scientific principles," Malcolm added, almost to himself, "not woodland fancy." Hollister stepped closer to the hearth, extending his hands to feel the remarkable heat it projected into the room. "I've never felt a fire radiate like this," he admitted. "It's almost like standing in summer sunshine." Malcolm nodded. "Radiant heat warms objects, not just air. More efficient." "My grandfather mentioned something similar once," Hollister continued, ignoring the impatient glance from Harmon. "He served at Valley Forge during the Revolution. Said General Washington had fireplaces installed that threw heat like magic compared to the old ones. Could this be the same design?" "Could be," Malcolm acknowledged. "Rumford's ideas spread through the colonies in the late 1790s. Many founding fathers adopted them." "Jefferson had them installed at Monticello," Harmon snorted. "If they're so miraculous, why doesn't every home in America have one? Progress leaves behind what doesn't work, Mr. Reed." Malcolm turned his attention to preparing a simple meal for his unexpected guests, seemingly uninterested in defending his hearth design further. But Hollister noticed how the trader positioned the cooking pot at a specific distance from the fire, not hanging directly over the flames, as was common practice, but set to the side where the radiant heat struck it most efficiently. Every aspect of Malcolm's interaction with the hearth reflected years of careful observation and adjustment. The storm that descended upon Clearwater Ridge that night proved to be unusually severe, even by the standards of the region. By morning, a foot of wet, heavy snow blanketed the landscape, with drifts piling against the north side of the trading post to a height of nearly 4 feet. The temperature had plummeted, and the wind continued to blow with a bitter intensity that made any thought of continuing the journey westward impossible. "We're stuck here until this breaks," Harmon announced after a brief reconnaissance outside. His earlier disdain for the trading post had given way to grudging appreciation for its sturdiness as the storm had intensified through the night. "Wesley, take stock of our provisions. We need to know where we stand if this lasts several days." Wesley nodded grimly. Their supplies had been calculated for steady progress westward, not for an extended delay. "Mr. Reed," he addressed their host with newfound respect, "we may need to purchase additional foodstuffs from your stores." Malcolm nodded. Fair prices, no gouging for the storm. It was a simple statement, but it carried weight in a territory where isolation and desperation often drove prices to extortionate levels during times of need. As the day progressed, the travelers observed their host's methodical approach to weathering the storm. Malcolm moved with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had faced countless winters alone, attending to tasks in a carefully considered sequence that wasted neither energy nor resources. Most notable was his approach to feeding the Rumford hearth, which consumed significantly less wood than a conventional fireplace would require to maintain the same level of warmth. "You truly do use less fuel," Harmon observed, watching as Malcolm added just 2 vertical logs to the fire, carefully positioned against the back wall. "I would have expected to be burning through a cord by now in this cold." Malcolm nodded. The design draws air in at the base of the fire, creating a more complete burn, less waste. He gestured to a woodpile stacked neatly along the eastern wall of the trading post. 7 cords for the winter. Cut, split, and stacked by June. 7 cords, Finch exclaimed. "My family in Pennsylvania goes through 15 or more, and our winters aren't half as harsh as what you face here." "Preparation," Malcolm replied simply. "Design. Observation." The efficiency of the hearth became more impressive as the day wore on and the temperature outside continued to drop. While conventional fireplaces would have struggled to heat the trading post's main room in such conditions, requiring constant attention and massive amounts of fuel, Malcolm's Rumford design maintained a steady, comfortable temperature with minimal wood consumption. More remarkable still was the absence of the usual drafts that plagued buildings heated by traditional fireplaces, which typically pulled cold air in through every crack and seam to replace the heated air rushing up the chimney. Hollister, whose natural curiosity had been piqued by the unusual hearth, spent much of the day observing its performance and questioning Malcolm about its principles. The trader, while not verbose, seemed willing to explain the scientific concepts behind the design to someone genuinely interested in understanding rather than mocking. "The conventional fireplace creates what's essentially a waterfall of air," Malcolm explained as they watched the flames. "Cold air rushes in from outside, gets heated by the fire, then immediately rushes up the chimney before it can warm the room. Most of the heat is wasted." He pointed to the rounded throat of his design. "This shape creates a different airflow pattern. It accelerates the smoke without pulling as much heated air with it." Hollister nodded thoughtfully. "Like narrowing a stream to make it flow faster without increasing the amount of water." "Exactly," Malcolm confirmed, a hint of approval in his usually impassive expression, "and the tall, shallow design maximizes radiant heat output. The flames heat the back wall, which then radiates that heat into the room rather than up the chimney." As the storm showed no sign of abating, the travelers settled into the unexpected respite. Malcolm's trading post revealed itself to be remarkably well appointed for such a remote location. The shelves held an extensive inventory of practical goods: tools, preserved foods, ammunition, clothing, and basic medical supplies. Unlike many frontier traders who focused on whiskey and tobacco, Malcolm had prioritized items essential for survival and self-sufficiency. By late afternoon, the initial tension between host and guests had eased somewhat, replaced by the peculiar intimacy that develops between strangers forced together by circumstance. Harmon and Wesley spread maps across a table, continuing to plan their business expansion despite the delay. The wagon drivers, Finch and a younger man named Caleb Morrison, played cards in one corner, occasionally trading frontier tales that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Malcolm himself maintained his customary reserve, attending to various tasks around the trading post while keeping the Rumford hearth fed with practiced precision. It was during dinner preparation that Hollister noticed another unusual aspect of Malcolm's approach to frontier living. While checking on a stew pot positioned near the hearth, the trader opened a small wooden cabinet built into the wall adjacent to the fireplace. Inside was a carefully organized collection of food items: dried herbs, preserved fruits, salt, and other seasonings. The cabinet was warm to the touch, heated by its proximity to the chimney. "A warming cabinet," Hollister observed. "Ingenious." Malcolm nodded. "Heat otherwise wasted. Now repurposed." You've thought of everything, haven't you? Hollister mused, increasingly impressed by the trader's systematic approach to frontier challenges. Malcolm's expression remained impassive. Not everything. Just what experience has taught. 23 winters here, each one a teacher. That evening, as they gathered around the hearth after a simple but satisfying meal, the conversation turned to the broader challenges of Western expansion. Harmon, loosened somewhat by a moderate amount of whiskey, expounded on his vision of a network of trading posts stretching to the Pacific, supplying the needs of settlers and extracting the resources of unexplored territories. "The future lies westward, gentlemen," he proclaimed, gesturing expansively, "a continent of untapped wealth awaiting those with the vision and fortitude to claim it." Wesley nodded in agreement. "And the key is efficient supply chains. The settlements fail when they can't get what they need, when they need it." "You're both right and wrong," Finch interjected, his voice rough from years of trail dust and raw whiskey. "Supply matters, sure enough. But what kills most newcomers isn't lack of goods, it's lack of knowledge." He gestured toward Malcolm. "Take our host here. He needs less because he knows more. Most greenhorns I haul westward pack all manner of useless trinkets, but haven't the first idea how to build a proper shelter or lay inadequate firewood." Malcolm, seated slightly apart from the group, offered no comment on this assessment, but Hollister noticed a slight nod of acknowledgment, almost imperceptible, in the flickering light. "Knowledge is certainly valuable," Harmon conceded, "but it must be paired with enterprise to yield results. What good is knowing how to survive if you merely exist?" He glanced around the trading post with its simple furnishings and utilitarian aesthetic. "No offense intended, Mr. Reed, but there's a difference between surviving and thriving." For the first time, Malcolm seemed slightly amused. "Different definitions of thriving," he observed quietly. "Some measure by accumulation, others by sufficiency." "Philosophical distinctions aside," Wesley interjected pragmatically, "we all agree that better knowledge of frontier conditions would improve survival rates and economic outcomes. The question is how to distribute that knowledge efficiently." Harmon's eyes lit up with sudden interest. "There's a market opportunity in that very question, Thomas. Educational materials for Western settlers, practical guides, equipment specifically designed for frontier conditions." He turned to Malcolm with new appreciation. "Your fireplace design, for instance. Properly marketed, it could save countless cords of wood across the territories while improving comfort and safety." Malcolm showed no reaction to this commercial vision of his hearth design. Instead, he rose and added another log to the fire, positioning it with the same careful precision he had demonstrated throughout the day. "Knowledge exists already," he remarked. "Rumford published his design 50 years ago. Not secret, just forgotten in the rush for newer, not better." The second day of forced cohabitation dawned with no improvement in weather conditions. If anything, the storm had intensified overnight, with wind-driven snow now piled in massive drifts that rendered the trading post effectively isolated from the outside world. The temperature had dropped further, transforming the windows into intricate canvases of frost patterns that obscured any view of the landscape beyond. Despite the worsening conditions outside, the interior of Malcolm's trading post remained remarkably comfortable. The Rumford hearth continued to radiate steady warmth throughout the main room, maintaining a consistent temperature that required far less fuel than conventional designs. This efficiency became more impressive as the storm's severity increased, highlighting the practical genius of the design in precisely the conditions it had been adapted to address. Harmon's party found themselves settling into an unexpected routine, their initial impatience giving way to a grudging acceptance of their situation. Wesley inventoried their supplies and calculated how long they could extend their provisions if the delay continued. Finch and Morrison checked on the horses in the small stable attached to the eastern side of the trading post, reporting that the animals were comfortable despite the brutal conditions. Hollister, his curiosity about Malcolm's innovations undiminished, continued to observe and occasionally question the trader about various aspects of his frontier adaptations. "I notice you've modified more than just the hearth," Hollister commented, as they inspected a series of catchments Malcolm had installed to collect rainwater from the trading post's roof. These gutters, they're designed to direct summer rain into storage barrels, but in winter they can be adjusted to prevent ice dams from forming on the roof edge. "Quite ingenious," Malcolm nodded. "Function changes with seasons. Design should accommodate." "Where did you learn all this?" Hollister asked. "You mentioned being a blacksmith in Boston, but these innovations seem far beyond typical trade knowledge." For a moment Malcolm was silent, his weathered face unreadable. Then, with unusual candor, he replied, "Loss teaches observation. When everything familiar vanishes, you see what remains more clearly." Before Hollister could inquire further about this cryptic statement, they were interrupted by Harmon, who had been examining Malcolm's inventory with the calculating eye of a merchant assessing potential competition. "You maintain an impressive stock for such a remote location, Mr. Reed," Harmon observed. "Far more variety than I would have expected." "How frequently do you resupply?" "Spring and fall," Malcolm replied. "Major items twice yearly, supplemented by trade with passing parties." Harmon nodded thoughtfully. "And yet I see no luxury items, no indulgences. Every shelf contains practical necessities, tools, basic foodstuffs, ammunition, medical supplies. You could increase your margins significantly by adding even a modest selection of comfort items, tobacco, finer spirits, imported textiles." "No need," Malcolm stated simply. "Stock what's needed, not what's wanted. Frontier has enough graves filled with men who chose comfort over preparation." This philosophy, so contrary to Harmon's commercial instincts, clearly perplexed the merchant. But before he could formulate a response, the conversation was interrupted by a sharp cracking sound from outside, followed by a thunderous crash that shook the trading post to its foundations. "Timber down," Malcolm stated calmly, moving toward the door. "Northeast corner. Weight of ice, most likely." The men followed him to the small porch that extended from the front of the trading post, shielding their faces from the biting wind as they peered through the swirling snow. A massive oak tree that had stood approximately 50 yards from the building had indeed succumbed to the weight of accumulated ice, crashing to the ground with such force that it had created a visible depression in the snow-covered earth. "That would have taken out half your roof if it had fallen this way," Finch observed, with the fatalistic calm of a man accustomed to frontier dangers. Malcolm nodded. "Why I clear 30 yards in all directions. Calculated maximum height of surrounding timber." "You foresaw even this?" Wesley asked, genuinely impressed by the trader's level of preparation. "Not foresaw. Observed. Prepared accordingly." Malcolm turned back toward the door, seemingly unperturbed by the near miss. "Nature gives warnings to those who pay attention. That oak showed stress signs 3 summers ago. Dead limbs on the northeast side, fungus at the base. Was only a matter of which winter would claim it." This level of observation and foresight struck the travelers differently, according to their temperaments. Harmon saw it as almost obsessive, a man with too much time and too little ambition focusing on minutiae. Wesley recognized its practical value, but considered it an extreme adaptation to isolation. Finch, with his years of frontier experience, nodded in approval of precautions that less seasoned travelers might dismiss as excessive. Hollister, however, was increasingly fascinated by the systematic way Malcolm had addressed the myriad challenges of frontier survival, seeing in it not mere adaptation, but a kind of practical philosophy. As they returned to the warmth of the trading post, Hollister commented quietly, "You've turned survival into a science, Mr. Reed. Every element considered, every resource maximized." Malcolm's response was characteristically concise. "Not science, just attention. Most men look without seeing, hear without listening, react without considering. Frontier punishes that luxury." The day progressed with each man attending to whatever tasks could be accomplished within the confines of their temporary shelter. Malcolm maintained his usual routine, checking supplies, tending the hearth, making minor repairs to equipment, and preparing meals with the same methodical efficiency that characterized all his actions. The travelers, for their part, alternated between planning for their eventual departure and simply passing time through conversation, card games, and rest. By evening, the storm showed signs of moderating, though the accumulated snow would still prevent travel for at least another day. As they gathered once more around the Rumford hearth, the atmosphere had shifted subtly from the previous night. The initial awkwardness of strangers forced together had given way to a more comfortable coexistence, and even Harmon's natural impatience seemed tempered by the inescapable reality of their situation. "I've been thinking about your hearth design," Harmon said as they finished a simple but hearty stew Malcolm had prepared. "There's considerable potential in it, particularly for western settlements, where wood is scarce in some regions. A properly manufactured version, with clear instructions for installation, could command a significant market." Malcolm regarded him steadily, but offered no comment. "I'm proposing a business arrangement," Harmon continued, undeterred by the trader's silence. "My company could produce iron components based on your design, throat pieces, dampers, grates. You would receive a percentage of each sale as the originator of the adapted design. With my distribution networks, we could make this available throughout the Western Territories within a year." "Not my design to sell," Malcolm finally replied. "Rumford published his work decades ago. Public knowledge. But your adaptations, your specific dimensions and angles, those are unique," Harmon persisted. "And more importantly, they're proven effective in frontier conditions. That's what I'm interested in." Malcolm shook his head slightly. "Knowledge shouldn't be hoarded or sold, especially knowledge that saves lives and resources." Harmon laughed, though without malice. A commendable sentiment, Mr. Reed, but impractical. Knowledge spreads fastest when there's profit in its dissemination. How many settlers will build your improved hearth if they never hear of it? How many will construct it correctly without proper guidance? Commerce is the most efficient vehicle for spreading innovation. For the first time, Malcolm seemed genuinely engaged in the conversation, his usually impassive expression showing a flicker of consideration. "Perhaps," he acknowledged, "but at what cost? What happens when profit, not function, drives design? When corners are cut to increase margins?" "That's where our interests align," Harmon countered smoothly. "Quality builds reputation. Reputation drives sales. There's no profit in failure." Malcolm fell silent, his gaze returning to the flames of his carefully designed hearth. The conversation shifted to other topics, but Hollister noticed that the trader seemed unusually thoughtful for the remainder of the evening, as if genuinely considering Harmon's proposition despite his initial resistance. The third morning brought clear skies and diminished winds, though the temperature remained well below freezing, and the snow lay deep across the landscape. After breakfast, Harmon announced that they would attempt to depart the following day if conditions continued to improve. "We've lost enough time already," he declared. "The trail will be difficult, but manageable with proper precautions. Mr. Reed will need to purchase additional provisions to replace what we've consumed during our stay." Malcolm nodded and began assembling the requested supplies, calculating fair prices with the same precision he applied to all tasks. As the others prepared for the eventual departure, Hollister found himself drawn once more to the Rumford hearth, studying its construction with renewed appreciation. "You never said whether you'd consider Mr. Harmon's proposal," Hollister remarked when Malcolm joined him. The trader was silent for a moment, then responded with unexpected candor. 23 years ago, I left Boston with nothing but tools and grief. My wife, Catherine, and infant daughter, Sarah, had died of scarlet fever within days of each other." His voice remained even, the pain long since transmuted into something else, not gone, but contained. "In my grief, I sought isolation. Thought I could outrun memory by putting enough distance between myself and all that was familiar." Hollister remained respectfully silent, recognizing the significance of this personal revelation from a man so habitually reserved. "What I found instead was that isolation strips away distraction," Malcolm continued, "forces you to see clearly what matters. On the frontier, The difference between life and death often comes down to observation, preparation, and proper use of limited resources. He gestured toward the hearth. This design isn't about comfort or convenience. It's about survival, about respecting the materials that sustain life. And you're concerned that commercialization would undermine that respect? Hollister suggested, beginning to understand the trader's reluctance. Malcolm nodded. When profit becomes the primary motive, function often suffers. Corners get cut, materials get substituted, integrity gets compromised. His gaze remained on the fire as he spoke. Not saying commerce has no value, but knowledge that saves lives should be shared freely, not packaged and sold to those who can afford it, while others freeze for lack of information. What if there were a way to do both? Hollister asked thoughtfully. To commercialize the design while ensuring its integrity and making the essential knowledge freely available? Before Malcolm could respond, they were interrupted by a commotion outside, the sound of voices calling for assistance. Moving quickly to the door, they discovered a small party of travelers approaching through the deep snow, clearly exhausted and in distress. 3 men, 1 injured, Malcolm observed, immediately moving to help. Frostbite likely. Preparation inadequate for conditions. The new arrivals proved to be fur trappers who had been caught unprepared by the early storm. Their companions suffered from severe frostbite on both feet, the result of inadequate footwear and their desperate attempt to reach Clearwater Ridge through the blizzard. Malcolm immediately cleared space near the hearth, positioning the injured man at the optimal distance for warmth without risking further tissue damage from excessive heat. What followed was a demonstration of frontier medical knowledge that impressed even Harmon. Malcolm treated the frostbitten feet with a sequence of carefully temperature-controlled baths, gradually warming the affected tissues while applying a salve of his own creation, a mixture of bearberry extract, pine resin, and other components he declined to specify. His movements were precise and methodical, betraying years of experience with such injuries. "You've done this before," Hollister observed, as they worked together to assist the injured trapper. "Too many times," Malcolm confirmed grimly. "Frontier forgives no lack of preparation. This man will lose 2 toes, possibly 3. Could have lost both feet or his life without shelter." The arrival of the trappers reinforced the precariousness of frontier existence in a way that mere conversation could not. Here was the stark reality: men who survived by their wilderness skills, brought low by inadequate preparation for conditions they should have anticipated. The object lesson was not lost on Harmon's party, particularly as they prepared for their own departure. That evening, their final night at the trading post, the atmosphere was subdued. The injured trapper rested as comfortably as his condition allowed, his companions grateful for Malcolm's intervention and hospitality. Harmon's party completed their preparations for departure while the Rumford hearth continued its efficient work, maintaining a consistent warmth throughout the expanded group, with remarkably little fuel consumption. After the others had retired for the night, Harmon approached Malcolm with a revised proposal. "I've been thinking about our conversation," the merchant began. "Your concerns about commercialization have merit. I'm proposing a compromise." Malcolm regarded him with his usual impassive expression, but indicated for Harmon to continue. "My company will produce components based on your adaptation of the Rumford design, maintaining strict quality standards. But alongside this commercial venture, we'll publish and freely distribute detailed construction plans for those who wish to build their own. We'll credit Rumford's original work and your frontier adaptations, emphasizing that this is knowledge that belongs to all, even as we offer convenience to those who prefer ready-made components." For several moments, Malcolm considered the proposal in silence. Finally, he spoke. "Words are easily spoken, commitments easily forgotten, once profit enters the equation." "True enough," Harmon acknowledged, "which is why I'm prepared to put it in writing. A binding agreement that the knowledge remains freely available, regardless of commercial success." Malcolm studied the merchant thoughtfully. "Why would you do this?" "Limits potential profit." "Because I'm a businessman, Mr. Reed." "Not a fool," Harmon replied frankly. "I've seen your hearth design in operation for 3 days now. Its efficiency is undeniable. There's profit to be made in quality components, even if the basic design is freely available. Moreover, widespread adoption of the design creates additional markets for related products. Andirons designed specifically for vertical log placement, cooking accessories adapted to the heat patterns, specialized tools for maintenance." It was a pragmatic approach that acknowledged Malcolm's ethical concerns while preserving Harmon's commercial interests, a rare middle ground between the trader's frontier philosophy and the merchant's market-driven worldview. "Consider it," Harmon concluded. "We depart tomorrow, but I can have formal documents drafted and sent back for your review within a month." Malcolm nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting the proposal. "We'll consider." The departure of Harmon's party the following morning was conducted with the efficiency characteristic of experienced travelers. The wagons were checked, supplies secured, routes confirmed. The snow remained deep, but the clear skies and diminished wind made travel possible, if not easy. As they prepared to set out, Hollister approached Malcolm one final time. "I want to thank you," the young accountant said sincerely, "not just for the shelter, but for the education. I've learned more about frontier adaptation in these few days than I could have from a dozen books on the subject." Malcolm acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Observation is the beginning of wisdom. Keep watching, keep adapting." "I'll do that," Hollister promised, "and I'll remember the Rumford hearth. Whether Mr. Harmon's venture proceeds or not, that knowledge won't be lost again, if I can help it." "Good," Malcolm replied simply. As the wagons pulled away from Clearwater Ridge, Harmon called back to the solitary figure of Malcolm Reed, still standing in the doorway of his trading post. "Consider my proposal, Mr. Reed. Knowledge and commerce can coexist when properly balanced." Malcolm raised a hand in acknowledgment but offered no verbal response. The wagons dwindled into the distance, leaving the trading post to its accustomed quiet, broken only by the occasional needs of the recovering trappers. The Rumford hearth continued its efficient work, radiating steady heat with minimal fuel consumption, a quiet testament to forgotten knowledge rediscovered and adapted to frontier necessity. The weeks that followed brought changes to Clearwater Ridge that none of its temporary inhabitants could have anticipated. The injured trapper, unable to travel until his feet healed, became an unwilling but eventually grateful student of Malcolm's systematic approach to frontier survival. His companions, after ensuring he was well situated, continued on their route with promises to return in spring, leaving behind payment in the form of prime furs and a pledge of future trade. Malcolm returned to his solitary routines, but with subtle differences. Harmon's proposal, while not immediately accepted, had sparked a reconsideration of his isolation and the knowledge he had accumulated over 2 decades of frontier adaptation. The merchant's pragmatic approach to balancing free distribution of life-saving information with commercial application offered a potential middle path between Malcolm's ethical concerns and the practical reality that knowledge spreads fastest when attached to commerce. By mid-December, with winter fully established across the Western Territories, Malcolm had reached a decision. Using one of his rare trips to the county seat to post a letter to Jacob Harmon in Cincinnati, he outlined his terms for cooperation: strict quality standards, free distribution of basic design principles, and a percentage of profits dedicated to distributing finished components to settlements that could not afford them. It was an arrangement that preserved his ethical framework while acknowledging the practical benefits of wider distribution. What Malcolm could not have anticipated was the chain of events his decision would set in motion. By early spring, as the first response from Harmon arrived confirming acceptance of his terms, other changes were manifesting along the frontier. Hollister, the young accountant, whose curiosity had been genuinely engaged by Malcolm's systematic adaptations, had begun documenting frontier survival techniques encountered during their continued journey westward. His journal, initially a personal record, gradually evolved into a more formal compilation of practical knowledge, a frontier survival guide that incorporated not only the Rumford hearth design but dozens of other adaptations observed among successful settlements. In Cincinnati, Harmon moved forward with production of iron components for the modified Rumford design, maintaining the quality standards Malcolm had insisted upon while actively distributing free construction plans as promised. The dual approach proved more profitable than anticipated, the availability of free plans actually increasing demand for the well-crafted components among those who recognized the design's value but lacked the skills to implement it from scratch. By the summer of 1848, word of the efficient hearth design had spread along trading routes throughout the Western Territories. The Harmon Heating Company's components could be found in settlements from the Appalachians to the Mississippi, while hand-drawn copies of the construction plans circulated among more remote homesteaders. What had begun as one man's adaptation of forgotten knowledge for personal survival had transformed into a widely distributed innovation that saved countless cords of wood and, likely, numerous lives during the harsh frontier winters. Malcolm Reed himself remained at Clearwater Ridge, his daily routines largely unchanged despite his unexpected connection to these broader developments. The trading post continued to serve as a waypoint for travelers, but with increasing frequency, those who stopped specifically sought information about the Rumford design and Malcolm's other frontier adaptations. Some came at Harmon's suggestion, others having heard tales of the trader's systematic approach to frontier challenges. What began as occasional inquiries gradually evolved into something more structured. By the autumn of 1848, Malcolm found himself hosting small groups of settlers seeking practical knowledge before establishing homesteads further west. His customary reticence gradually gave way to a spare but effective teaching style, focusing on observation, preparation, and the efficient use of limited resources. The lessons were never formal, always practical, demonstrations of techniques refined through decades of frontier experience. In late October, as the first snow dusted Clearwater Ridge and thoughts turned once more to the approaching winter, Malcolm received an unexpected visitor. Peter Hollister, the curious accountant from Harmon's party, returned to the trading post, not passing through, but deliberately seeking Malcolm out. "I've left Harmon's employment," Hollister explained as they sat beside the Rumford hearth that had sparked his initial curiosity. "I'm establishing a school of frontier practices 50 miles west of here, at the junction of Thompson's Creek and the old military road. I've spent the past year documenting successful adaptation techniques from settlements throughout the territories." He placed a leather-bound journal on the table between them. "This is the beginning of what I hope will become a comprehensive guide to frontier survival and prosperity. Your systematic approach to the challenges of this environment forms its foundation." Malcolm examined the journal with his characteristic thoroughness, noting the precise drawings, clear explanations, and practical focus of the content. It was knowledge presented without embellishment or exaggeration, respecting both the reader's intelligence and the seriousness of frontier challenges. "Good work," he acknowledged, recognizing in Hollister a kindred spirit, someone who understood that on the frontier, precision and preparation were not academic exercises, but essential components of survival. "I want you to be part of this," Hollister continued, "not just as a source, but as a teacher. The school I envision won't be a traditional academic institution, but a practical training center for those heading further west. A place where essential knowledge is shared before it's needed, rather than learned through costly mistakes." It was a proposition that would have been unthinkable to Malcolm even a year earlier, an invitation to abandon his solitude and engage directly with the wider flow of westward expansion. But the events set in motion by Harmon's visit and the subsequent spread of the Rumford design had already begun to transform his relationship with isolation. The trading post, once his refuge from human connection, had increasingly become a node in a network of practical knowledge exchange. "We'll consider," Malcolm replied, neither accepting nor rejecting the proposal outright. Hollister nodded, understanding by now that this was neither evasion nor dismissal, but Malcolm's genuine process, deliberate consideration without hasty commitment. "Take the winter to think on it," he suggested. "I'll return in spring as we begin construction." The winter of 1848-1849 proved to be one of the most severe in memory throughout the Western Territories. Heavy snowfall and prolonged periods of extreme cold tested the resilience of settlements from the Appalachians to the Mississippi. Reports eventually reached Clearwater Ridge of entire communities devastated by inadequate preparation, shortages of firewood, collapsing structures, livestock lost to exposure. Yet amid these grim accounts came other stories of settlements that had weathered the brutal conditions with remarkable resilience, many of them attributing their survival to the efficient Rumford hearth design that had spread along the frontier over the preceding months. The modified fireplaces, whether constructed from Harmon's manufactured components or built from freely distributed plans, had allowed families to maintain livable temperatures while consuming significantly less wood than traditional designs would have required. For Malcolm Reed, these reports provided a kind of validation he had never sought, but nonetheless found meaningful. The knowledge he had adapted and refined through years of solitary observation was proving its worth beyond his personal survival. Lives were being preserved, resources conserved, frontier hardship mitigated through the simple application of forgotten scientific principles to practical challenges. As spring gradually reclaimed Clearwater Ridge from winter's grip, Malcolm reached a decision that would have been unimaginable to him just years before. When Peter Hollister returned as promised, he found the trader methodically packing essential tools and resources, preparing to relocate his operation. "Decided to accept your proposal," Malcolm stated without preamble. "Knowledge is more valuable in circulation than in isolation." Together they established what would become known as the Clearwater School of Frontier Practices at the junction Hollister had selected. The original trading post remained operational under new management, a family Malcolm had trained in its maintenance, while Malcolm himself focused on systematizing and teaching the practical knowledge he had accumulated through decades of frontier adaptation. The school was unlike any conventional educational institution of its time. It focused exclusively on practical skills and systematic approaches to frontier challenges, from construction techniques adapted to local materials to resource management strategies for varying environments. At its center, both physically and philosophically, stood a massive Rumford hearth, a continuous demonstration of the principles Malcolm considered most essential to frontier survival: careful observation, systematic adaptation, and the efficient use of limited resources. Word of the school spread along frontier routes, drawing students from diverse backgrounds, families preparing for westward settlement, existing homesteaders seeking to improve their practices, even representatives from Eastern manufacturing concerns interested in developing products better suited to frontier conditions. What had begun as one man's solitary adaptation to personal loss had evolved into a nexus of practical knowledge exchange that influenced settlement patterns across the expanding territories. In Cincinnati, the Harmon Heating Company continued to prosper, its manufactured Rumford components maintaining the quality standards Malcolm had insisted upon. True to his agreement, Jacob Harmon ensured that construction plans remained freely available alongside commercial products, and a percentage of profits supported distribution of components to settlements that could not afford them. The dual approach, commercial distribution alongside free knowledge sharing, proved more effective at spreading innovation than either method alone would have achieved. By 1850, the modified Rumford design had become standard in new construction throughout much of the western frontier, its efficiency particularly valued in regions where timber resources were limited. The design's revival and adaptation represented a rare instance of forgotten knowledge reclaimed and widely implemented without the typical cycles of rediscovery and loss that characterized so much of frontier development. For Malcolm Reed, the transformation from isolated trader to reluctant teacher brought an unexpected form of healing. The knowledge he had cultivated as a shield against grief had become a legacy more meaningful than he could have anticipated. In sharing the systematic approach to survival he had developed during his years of solitude, he found a purpose that transcended personal preservation. The Clearwater School continued to evolve under the joint guidance of Malcolm and Hollister, each contributing complementary skills to its development. Malcolm's deep practical knowledge and systematic approach formed its foundation, while Hollister's organizational abilities and talent for clear documentation ensured that the knowledge spread beyond those who studied directly at the school. By 1860, as tensions between North and South threatened to engulf the nation in conflict, the principles taught at Clearwater had influenced settlement practices across much of the western frontier. The Rumford hearth design, once ridiculed by travelers encountering it at Malcolm's isolated trading post, had become so commonplace that few remembered a time when frontier fireplaces had been constructed differently. The efficient use of wood it enabled had preserved countless acres of timber that would otherwise have been consumed in less efficient hearths, while the improved heating it provided had saved innumerable lives during harsh winter conditions. In the spring of 1863, as Civil War raged in the East, Malcolm Reed died peacefully at the school he had helped establish, not in isolation, but surrounded by students and colleagues who had come to respect both his knowledge and the quiet integrity with which he shared it. He was 73 years old and had long since ceased to be the solitary figure who had once sought refuge from grief in frontier isolation. In accordance with his wishes, Malcolm was buried on a ridge overlooking the school, his grave marked by a simple stone bearing only his name and the dates of his life. But his true memorial stood in settlements throughout the Western Territories, thousands of Rumford hearths efficiently warming homes with half the wood of traditional designs, silent testaments to the enduring value of forgotten knowledge reclaimed and shared. Peter Hollister continued Malcolm's work, eventually publishing The Clearwater Guide to Frontier Practices, a comprehensive compilation of the practical knowledge they had systematized together. The book became an essential resource for settlers throughout the expanding nation, its practical approach to frontier challenges, saving countless lives and resources in the decades that followed. The Rumford hearth design itself enjoyed a revival that extended far beyond the frontier, its efficiency recognized anew by a generation facing resource challenges its predecessors had ignored. What had once been dismissed as a fool's fire pit by travelers encountering it at a remote trading post had become a symbol of practical wisdom, a reminder that innovation often consists not of inventing something entirely new, but of rediscovering and adapting knowledge that has been forgotten in the rush toward what is merely novel rather than truly improved. In this way, the legacy of Malcolm Reed and his efficient hearth extended far beyond his lifetime, influencing not just how people heated their homes, but how they approached the fundamental challenges of existence in challenging environments. The core principles he had embodied, careful observation, systematic adaptation, efficient use of resources, and the open sharing of life-preserving knowledge, remained relevant long after the specific conditions of frontier life had given way to new challenges. The travelers who had once laughed at his fool's fire pit could not have anticipated how it would transform frontier development, nor how the quiet trader's insistence on function over fashion would ultimately influence settlement patterns across a continent. But in the warm hearths of countless homes built to maximize heat while minimizing wood consumption, the wisdom of Malcolm Reed's approach continued to radiate outward, practical, understated, essential. Like the Rumford design itself, which directed heat into living spaces rather than wasting it up chimneys, Malcolm's legacy focused on what truly mattered, not recognition or profit, but the preservation of life and resources through the practical application of carefully observed principles. In a world increasingly drawn to novelty for its own sake, this quiet insistence on substance over style, on function over fashion, on carefully tested practice over hasty innovation, remains perhaps the most valuable lesson of the hearth that burned hotter with half the wood.